The Case for Animal Rights, written by Tom Regan, narrated by Jennifer Pickens. Foreword narrated by Gary Comstock. Discussion on writing The Case for Animal Rights, narrated by Tom Regan. Every great movement must experience 3 stages: ridicule, discussion, adoption. John Stuart Mill. Foreword.
Regan and the History of Animal Rights by Gary Comstock. It's not widely acknowledged that Tom Regan cared as much about human rights as he did about animal rights. He taught a popular course at North Carolina State University on human rights, wrote about the subject often, and protested against the death penalty outside the state penitentiary in Raleigh. I think it's useful to set his contributions to animal rights in this wider context, because he would have taken pleasure in seeing what's happened in the past 2 decades to the movement. It's been strengthened, deepened, and widened by the contributions of women and underrepresented minorities, groups whose rights have historically been ignored, and whose rights Tom also championed. The following observations are both provisional and provincial. Provisional because very tentative, not the result of academic research, and provincial because they're simply the personal reflections of a 70-year-old white male from North Carolina. Here's my story in 2 chapters. The first wave of animal rights, 1975 to 2000 roughly, and the second wave after 2000. The first wave. Tom began thinking about animal rights, I believe, around 1973, the same year that Peter Singer published his book review, Animal Liberation. 2 years later, when Peter's book by that name came out, Tom published his first piece on the subject, The Moral Basis of Vegetarianism. In my view, and in the view of many textbook editors, Peter and Tom set the stage for what was to come. As readers may know, Singer approached the issue with the 2-level utilitarianism of his mentor, R.M. Hare. Singer argued that animals should be liberated just because they are sentient, because confinement causes them pain and frustration, and because we ought to treat similar cases in a similar manner. The principle of universalizability demands that we give equal weight to the like interests of all parties affected by an action. All sentient animals, Singer argued, have morally relevant interests that we must take into account when considering how to treat them. Tom, as you may know, disagreed with Singer's utilitarianism and adopted a deontological position. He held that every individual who is the subject of a life has inherent worth. Every human, including the severely congenitally cognitively limited, those humans who lack the capacity to be held responsible for their actions, who lack language, rationality, autonomy, self-consciousness, are nonetheless subjects of a life. Simply in virtue of the fact that the cognitively limited are subjects of a life, they have inherent worth. Some animals, Regan continued, have the same mental states. The animals may lack language, rationality, autonomy, and self-consciousness, but this limitation has no bearing on their inherent worth. Insofar as an animal has the same cognitive capacities as some humans, those animals, just like the humans, are conscious subjects of a life whose experiences matter to them. All those with inherent worth have natural moral rights, and all those with rights have equal rights. Justice, Regan also argues, requires that we treat like cases alike, so it follows that some animals have a right to life that is equal to a human's right to life. It seems to me that Tom and Peter were the 2 most influential figures early on. Now, they certainly were not alone, and over the next 25 years, many other philosophers joined them. I'm sure I'll overlook important thinkers if I try to construct a list of names, but in order to recognize some of them, let me at least mention Mary Midgley, Marianne Warren, James Rachels, Bernie Rowland, Ray Fry, Evelyn Pluhar, Priscilla Cohn, Steve Saponsis, Dale Jameson, Michael A. Fox, Jeff McMahon, Gary Varner, Lily Rousseau, David DeGrazia, Tom Beecham, Carol Adams, Gary Francione, and Alistair Norcross. I have surely and unfortunately overlooked important figures. Among the larger group, there were serious differences of opinion, but there were certain commonalities too. I'll refer to this first group as the first wave. And the first thing to be said about all of them is that they faced strong headwinds, working in professional communities that patronized them and facing publics that ridiculed them when not ignoring them. Tom faced a credible threat on his life by a university administrator. Nonetheless, they took it upon themselves to convince disinterested audiences that philosophical issues concerning animals were important. The way they tried to do so was by calling attention to cognitive states of individual animals. Thus, the primary locus of value for the first wave was in what Tom called the non-human subject of a life. Tom never defined that concept. What he wrote about it is that it involves more than merely being alive and more than merely being conscious. Individuals are subjects, he writes in the case for animal rights, if they have beliefs and desires, perception, memory, and a sense of the future, including their own future, an emotional life together with feelings of pleasure and pain, preference and welfare interests, the ability to initiate action in pursuit of their desires and goals, a psychophysical identity over time, and an individual welfare in the sense that their experiential life fares well or ill for them. That's Tom's way into the subject. Others, most prominently Peter, took different approaches. But again, everyone in the group was certain that animals' interests count, that animals' lives mattered, and that there were sound arguments for thinking so. Another commonality among the thinkers was normative. Because of the kind of cognitive states animals have, those states matter morally. Tom's way of putting this was that animals are owed respect because they're ends in themselves. They're ends in themselves because they are subjects of a life, and as subjects of a life, they have inherent value and natural moral rights. All individuals with inherent value are owed equal respect with every other such individual. This is the reason Tom often said, controversially and yet with conviction, that animals, or mammals at least, were the equals of humans. He thought of moral rights as trump cards that protect their holders from being used as a means to another's ends. Adopting Kantian and Rawlsian-style arguments that all humans who have autonomy and moral agency have equal moral standing, Tom argued that were this not true, then the more intelligent among us would be justified in enslaving the least intelligent among us. However, this perfectionist result is unthinkable, he argued, and he thought that he had here a reductio argument to show why we must reject Peter's consequentialism. Consequentialism, Tom thought, allows us to use animals as instruments whenever doing so will produce the greatest good. I don't want to get into the differences between Tom and Peter. That's very well-trod territory. Rather, I want to paint in broad strokes a few more overarching themes that characterize the group as a whole. Both Tom and Peter and others wrote about companion animals and wildlife, but wildlife and companions were not top of mind. And when someone in the group took up wildlife, they typically did so through the lens of animal rights or utilitarianism. For example, here are the titles of 4 of 10 papers in Priscilla Cohn's edited volume on ethics and wildlife. The basic moral rights of humans and non-humans, wildlife and animal rights, philosophical perspectives on hunting, evolutionary covenants, domestication, wildlife, and animal rights. The third paper is the only one not to have rights in its title, and it was contributed by Tom Regan. As you might imagine, his argument is replete with rights considerations. Other themes of these early years, besides rights, were an almost overriding concern with the treatment of so-called food animals, and cows and pigs, or mammals more generally, were discussed more extensively than birds or fish. Mammals were regarded as moral patients, subject to harms that philosophers might be able to help prevent. They tended to think ethical claims were objective and that animal abusers should be pressured into changing their practices by strategic reforms to law and policy. They took other philosophers to be their primary audience, but they did not neglect the practical implications of their work. In this area, certain animal abuses took prominence, such as the production of veal, gestation crates for sows, battery cages for hens, tail docking and branding, and so on. Let me pause here to acknowledge that my scheme, like all binary schemes, surely oversimplifies some very complex terrain. Distinguishing only a first and second wave no doubt obscures important differences, showing the effects of taking an axe to a task requiring a scalpel. I especially regret not having time to acknowledge some of the lesser-known writers, especially Gary Varner's two-level Kantian utilitarianism, which represents a via media between the erstwhile rival commitments of Regan's deontological view and Singer's utilitarian approach. Varner's version of Hare's consequentialism argues, persuasively to my mind, that we ought to think more or less as rights theorists in everyday decisions about animals, Regan, one might say, for the grocery store, while thinking as strict utilitarians in those unusual cases for which the intuitive level system has not yet evolved a rule. Singer, for example, for wildlife management. Varner provides a compelling argument for universal prescriptivism, the meta-ethical theory developed by Hare, who was, as Varner notes, Singer's teacher. That said, we can ask how effective were Tom and colleagues in helping to end the abuse of animals? There's some reason for a positive assessment on this score. For example, vegetarianism increased from 1.2% of Americans in 1978 to over 6% in 2018. Cosmetic research on animals was widely condemned. Chicken battery cages were enlarged. Sow gestation crates were outlawed in some places. The scientific research of the 3 R's was enforced. PETA was founded in 1980. The first animal rights course was taught at a U.S. law school, Rutgers, in 1989. A farm sanctuary established for animals used in agriculture in Watkins Glen, New York in 1986. However, there are also ample reasons to think the first wave was a gentle little wave indeed. For example, in India, vegetarianism fell from 33% in 2018 to 25.5% in 2023. It also fell dramatically in China from 9% to 6% during the last 5 years. I'm not reporting data here. It's just a personal sense I have that the first wave did not do what Tom hoped his writings might do, turn all Americans into vegans. I want to note one more commonality. Members almost exclusively worked alone throughout the last century. Even though Tom and Peter co-edited Animal Rights and Human Obligations early on, Tom did not continue their collaboration. Like almost every philosopher of that era, Tom published almost exclusively as a sole author. Peter's an exception and has written collaboratively since at least 1980. The practice of sole authorship remains the norm today in the philosophy profession, although we are beginning to see promising cracks in it. Finally, a comment about the institutional context in which these people worked. The philosophers swam upstream. No philosophy department, I dare say, had a position in animal philosophy or ethics. In 1979, as best I can tell, in the US, there were no courses on animal ethics, no journals devoted to the topic, no government agencies giving grants for research on animal ethics. Furthermore, apart from these few brave souls, true philosophers had little interest in the subject, looking askance at publications on the topic. And even worse, in analytic circles, and accepting specialists in moral theory, philosophers who did ethics were not exactly regarded as rock stars in the field. That honor was reserved for metaphysicians and epistemologists. And to deepen the indignity, animal ethics people worked on issues in so-called applied ethics, a phrase rarely uttered in the philosophy department corridor without a raised eyebrow. So my hat's off to Tom and all of these hardy souls for their courage and persistence. The second wave, 2000 to the present. Tom died in 2017. Were he alive today, he might recognize what I'll call a second wave in animal ethics. Now, thinkers seem to focus less on individual animals, more on animal relationships. Now, thinkers seem to aim more at creating conditions in which animal groups can flourish, less on ending harms done to individual animals. Whereas the first wave often portrayed animals as moral patients, targets of harms done to them, the second wave often draws attention to animals as moral agents, active decision makers capable of making changes in their relationships and environments. Tom and other leaders of the first wave played an instrumental role in calling the public's attention to the harms done to individual animals. Leaders of the second wave seem to focus more on other dimensions of animal experience, to include animals' pleasures as well as their pains, and the spheres in which animals exercise agency as participants in groups, as well as their patient status as recipients of others' actions. As I see it, and at the risk of overlooking important contributors, leaders of the second wave include Martha Nussbaum, Christine Korsgaard, Kristen Andrews, Laurie Gruen, Claire Palmer, Jeff Sebo, Mark Rowlands, Elizabeth Anderson, Jonathan Birch, Jillian Crozier, Andrew Fenton, Tyler John, Sid Johnson, Robert Jones, Susanna Manso, Sue Donaldson, Will Kimlicka, Letitia Meynell, David Pena Guzman, Rebecca Walker, Adam Shriver, and Alistair Cochran. While varying in emphasis, all these writers recognize the empathic, nurturing, and normative capacities of many species, the animal's abilities to form social relationships, act proposively, behave cooperatively, and derive enjoyment from cultural activities. I note an emphasis on interest-specific relationships between individual animals, whether they have rules governing acceptable behavior, and if they do, how any social norms may have evolved, are now internalized and enforced, and, if possible, changed. Tom would have championed the work of people like Sonora Taylor, an animal advocate writing as a member of the disabilities community. He'd have promoted her idea of cripping animal ethics and drawn attention to the strategies she employs to highlight the ways that differently abled humans and non-humans are devalued. I have no doubt he'd have felt similarly about the work of Af and Sil Coe, who explore the hidden connections between various forms of social injustice. Their book, Afroism, reveals the ways binary and hierarchical thinking blinds us to systems of oppression and explains the steps movements for social justice must take to respond. Feminist criticisms of racism and speciesism share tools and perspectives essential to reforming society in the radical ways required. In the second wave, there's also an important new focus on climate change and its effects on animals. Jeff Sebo has written about the role of institutions in addressing climate change's dangers for animals, showing how these problems intersect with other human rights issues, such as unemployment and unequal educational opportunities. As I say, I have no doubt that Tom would be celebrating and promoting the work of these New Wave scholars, even as he would acknowledge their criticisms of him. He might also point out that they present a novel opportunity for changing public attitudes about our treatment of other mammals. By highlighting the agential and cultural dimensions of animals, recent authors are building a new pragmatic approach, enlightening the public that the animals raised in industrial conditions could, under other regimes, not simply be free of pain and deprivation. The animals could also enjoy their lives. Whereas first waivers worked primarily as sole authors, second waivers are often found working in interdisciplinary teams. For example, Kristen Andrews works in the field alongside scientists studying, for example, dolphins in Hawaii and orangutans in Borneo. Her book, How to Study Animal Minds, argues that comparative psychology has suffered from several mistakes, including anti-anthropomorphism, adherence to Morgan's canon, and a failure to find a common language for comparing human and animal traits. For example, psychologists have no trouble referring to human episodic memory, but stumble when it comes to attributing the same trait to animals, defaulting to the term episodic-like memory for animals. These are errors the second wave is keen to rectify, errors in empirical work, compare Laurie Gruen's work, and in philosophical analysis, compare Mark Rowland's work. But that's another story. I noted some of the practical changes we might credit to the first wave. It's too soon to compose any kind of comprehensive list of changes for the second wave, but a few recent events are worth mentioning. Fur sales and exotic animals in circuses were banned in California in 2019. A lawsuit was filed to release a captive chimpanzee on the basis of a writ of habeas corpus by the Non-Human Rights Project in 2013. And in 2018, a New York Court of Appeals justice wrote that a writ of habeas corpus filed on behalf of a chimpanzee, quote, demands our attention. Concerning strategies for change, my grandma used to say you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. I don't want to say that the first wave was a scold, but its opponents may have felt that way. The second wave, however, seems more like an inviting host, welcoming everyone into a bigger tent. Again, I'm certain Tom would have been open to this approach, finding in it a vision of something hopeful and visionary. Now a cautionary note. Tom once mentioned to me that as we move ahead towards slaughter-free forms of feeding ourselves, we should expect increasingly hostile reactions. As activists advocated for the rights of minorities, women, and the LGBTQ movements, they encountered resistance and enmity. Those championing the rights of animals are not a major part of the cultural scene yet. In terms of other issues, such as climate change, immigration policy, threats to democracy, war in Ukraine, and Tom Brady's candidacy for GOAT status, animal activism flies pretty low, still under the radar. As that changes, as claims for animal rights gain traction and laws are passed with greater frequency, the activists' visibility will rise. And as the progressive left moves forward, those on the right will no doubt feel threatened. They will want to protect their right to eat meat. They may feel that their religious beliefs justify them in their way of life. If they come to feel that their identity is being taken away, they may also become desperate. They may take up arms against those defending animals' rights. I hope Tom's concerns about violence do not come to fruition, but he lived in a country where there were more firearms than people. Nothing has changed on that score. And Tom knew the lessons of history. Violence has always been used against the oppressed and those who join them in asserting their rights. To help diffuse such reactions, demonstration models of economically successful transitions to animal-first styles of farming, ranching, and zookeeping could be critical. Philosophers with a social conscience could help initiate, support, and publicize practical demonstrations of orderly social change. Tom would have lent his voice to that effort too. That's it. Just a very rough outline of the ways Tom's efforts on behalf of animals fit into the last half-century of reflection on the subject. He cared as much about humans as non-humans, taught and advocated for the dignity of all subjects of a life, and took great pleasure in linking arms with women, underrepresented minorities, the disabled, and all who used their voices to champion rights, human and otherwise.
Preface to the 2004 edition. A captain who does not know where he wants to sail, there is no wind on earth that will bring him there. Ami Ayalon. Before I sat down to write this preface, I had not read the case for animal rights from cover to cover for more than 20 years. Bits and pieces I had read, but never the whole book. Reading it anew was like looking through an album of old photographs. Yes, that's me, age 10, playing in the snow with my dog friend Tippy. There I am, decked out in full uniform with my high school football team. That one is from my wedding. One of my favorites, with my back to the camera, hands on my hips. I am looking at the Wren Library, Trinity College, Cambridge. But while that's me in all those pictures, I have changed so much in the intervening years that, in some ways, looking at the person in those old photographs is like looking at a stranger. That is how I felt as I began to read the case, after so much time had elapsed. Even while I knew that, yes, those were my words I was reading, I did not feel any sense of personal identification with them. At least, this is how I felt up to Chapter 6. From that point to the end, I began to feel reunited with my former self. In particular, I began to experience again what I had experienced as I was writing those later chapters. It was a time like no other in my life. Let me explain. I started to write the case in September 1980 and finished in November 1981. I had been writing about ethics and animals in general, and animal rights in particular, for several years, so I did not begin from ground zero. My philosopher's bags were packed with some more or less settled convictions, as well as some more or less well-developed arguments. I thought I knew where I wanted to go and the best way to get there. I was, or so I fancied myself, very much in charge. Here is a question. Are animals aware of anything? There is a blank page. Assignment: fill the blank page with my thoughts. It was effortless work. I enjoyed it immensely. However, when I began to work my way through Chapter 6, which is mainly devoted to a critique of utilitarianism, something happened. It was as if, and I know this will sound strange, but I'll risk it anyhow, it was as if I ceased to be the book's author. Words, sentences, paragraphs, whole pages came from where? I did not know. What I was writing was new to me. It did not represent anything I had ever thought before. But the words took up permanent residence on the page as fast as I could write them down. This was more than enjoyable. This was exhilarating. But here's the real puzzle. The exhilaration did not last for a few minutes or hours or days or even weeks. I was in this state, without interruption, for months. It is no exaggeration for me to say that during this time I had lost control over where the book was going. For all intents and purposes, I was just along for the ride, which is why I think the most original parts of the case, the final 4 chapters where I state and defend the respect, harm, minoride, worse off, and liberty principles, are not something for which I can take much credit. In a very real sense, they came to me as a gift. Even as I write these words, I have to shake my head in wonder, still unable to understand how it all happened. Let me add 4 further observations about how I experienced the process of writing the case, and some of what I learned as the work evolved. I will have something more to say on these matters near the end. When I started, I had reformist aspirations. Terrible things were being done to animals. In the hands of researchers and farmers, for example, they were being made to suffer unnecessarily. I thought I could explain why this was true and why it should stop. This way of thinking, I realized, allowed for the possibility that making animals suffer would not be wrong if it were necessary. Well, I thought I could explain why that was true, too. When the first words of the case were written, I fully intended to defend the use of animals in biomedical research, for example, provided they were not caused any unnecessary pain. This was not how things turned out. By the time I addressed the use of animals as tools in research, the logic of the argument I was following had converted me to an abolitionist position. It seems obviously true to me today that you don't justify overriding an animal's rights because others will benefit. It was not obviously true to me when I started my journey. Not until I lost control of where the book was heading, and only after my critique of utilitarianism went deeper than it had gone before, did I begin to be transformed into an abolitionist. Some philosophers no doubt write books to defend what they already believe. However often this might be true in other cases, it is manifestly not true in this one. Second, the case does more than argue for animal rights. It seeks to describe and ground a family of basic human rights, especially for the most vulnerable members of the extended human family, for example, young children. As I have said on many occasions, I never would have become an animal rights advocate if I had not first been a human rights advocate. While in the past, the main interest of friend and foe alike has been, and understandably so, in my argument for animal rights, I hope new readers will not overlook and will test the mettle of my more fundamental argument for human rights. Third, as the logic of the argument unfolded, I began to realize that what power the book possessed, if any, was to be found in its critique of large-scale social practices, including animal agriculture, biomedical research, and recreational hunting. Granted, the moral assessment of human behavior involves much more than the moral assessment of social practices. In particular, it involves the moral assessment of the extremely difficult decisions individuals face when rights conflict. In the interest of completeness, some of these sorts of conflicts are considered in the case and will be reviewed below. That said, readers will recognize that the case's primary focus is macro, not micro, emphasizing as it does questions about the justice of practices, institutions, enterprises, or similar undertakings. Finally, despite the gesture towards completeness I have just mentioned, it was painfully obvious to me as I wrote it that the case was far from offering a complete moral theory. Even in the area of justice, I went on to add, many difficult questions, for example, about justice in the distribution of harms and benefits between individuals, remain to be explored. I will need to remind readers of my frank acknowledgement of incompleteness later when I reply to some of my critics. What I claimed on behalf of my position, the rights view, as I call it, stopped well short of any chest-thumping about completeness. The rights view, I wrote, identifies, clarifies, and defends a set of ethical principles that must be accommodated by any theory that aspires to be the best theory, all considered. More than 20 years later, and though mistaken I may be, none of my critics has convinced me that I should think any differently today, which helps explain why I have seen fit to make only typographical changes scattered throughout the text. Of course, these autobiographical sketches go no way towards proving that the case for animal rights contains so much as a single word of truth. Who knows but that, during those heady months, I was channeling the delusory dicta of Descartes' deceitful demon. The truth of what we think is logically distinct from what motivates us to think it. Every philosopher understands this, and philosophers, being philosophers, could care less about what it was like to be Tom Regan in the early 1980s. What interests them is the truth, or otherwise, of the words on the page. It should hardly be surprising, therefore, that my professional colleagues have challenged the central, and sometimes the incidental, messages of the case. Leveling fair, informed criticism is how philosophers show their respect for one another. Before responding to their criticisms, a few general observations are in order. Philosophical and other critics of animal rights. Animal rights is more than a philosophical idea. It is also part of the name of a burgeoning social justice movement, the animal rights movement. Judged by contemporary standards, the movement's goals may seem radical to most people, including many philosophers. Members active in the movement, myself included, are not satisfied when hog producers or fur mill operators make changes they say will treat animals more humanely. Instead, we demand an end to raising animals for food, an end to killing them for their fur. Not larger cages, we declare, empty cages. Those who speak for the world's vivisectors and furriers have challenged the idea of animal rights, as have representatives of the greyhound racing industry and the meat industry, and with good reason. The triumph of animal rights will put these industries out of business. That people with very different ideas about how animals may be treated would challenge the idea of animal rights is as understandable as it is predictable. Which ideas are true, which unfounded, should be decided on the basis of the fair, informed clash of ideas. If those of us who believe in animal rights bid the world to listen to and act on the truth as we see it, it is only fitting that the same opportunity should be made available to representatives of Ringling Brothers and the Professional Rodeo Cowboy Association. All of us who prize freedom of inquiry, and perhaps none more so than philosophers, not only should welcome critical public scrutiny of controversial ideas, we should be among the first to insist upon it. In some hands, however, fairness is an ideal more honored in the breach than the observance. Throughout history, scurrilous attacks on the messenger have been a familiar way to attempt to discredit the message. Predictably enough, In lieu of fair criticism of my philosophical case for animal rights, some people in high places, including some in the lofty towers of academe, have attacked me instead of addressing my ideas. For example, they have slandered my character by accusing me of inciting others to riot, and by implicating me in the commission of a variety of violent crimes, including murder. Now, all this would be funny in an Evelyn Wash sort of way if it were simply a case of spokespersons for powerful professional and economic interests beating up on a graying, quixotic moral philosopher bent on tilting his blunt ideas against the resistant armor of entrenched institutions. But in view of the real life, there are no other words for it, carnage that is at issue, there is not much to laugh about. 48 billion animals are slaughtered annually for food throughout the world. That's more than 130 million every day. In excess of 5 million every hour. Over 91,000 a minute. Some 1,500 every second. And these figures do not include the billions of other animals whose lives are taken, whose bodies are injured, and whose freedom is stolen in the name of entertainment, sport, or fashion. When viewed in this larger context, the deliberate attempt to silence my voice by sullying my character is not very funny at all. For their part, with few exceptions, the philosophers who are to be counted among my critics have behaved in an exemplary fashion. No name-calling, no threats or intimidation, no besmirching of my reputation, just good old-fashioned, in-your-face critical analysis. Wherever the truth lies, whether on my side of the debate or elsewhere, the principled manner in which these critics have comported themselves gives philosophers reason to be proud of the high standards of our discipline and of the people who practice it. As I will try to explain, many of their criticisms rest on more or less serious misunderstandings of my position. Misunderstandings, I have no doubt, that at least some of the time result from my failure to state my views as clearly as I should have. By explaining both where and why others have misunderstood my meaning in the past, and where and why my meaning could have been clearer, I hope the incidence of such misunderstandings will be reduced in the future. Before responding to representative objections, it will be useful if I give a thumbnail sketch of the rights view. The rights view. My position, roughly speaking, may be summarized as follows. Some non-human animals resemble normal humans in morally relevant ways. In particular, they bring the mystery of a unified psychological presence to the world. Like us, they possess a variety of sensory, cognitive, conative, and volitional capacities. They see and hear, believe and desire, remember and anticipate, plan and intend. Moreover, what happens to them matters to them. Physical pleasure and pain, these they share with us. But also fear and contentment, anger and loneliness, frustration and satisfaction, cunning and imprudence. These and a host of other psychological states and dispositions collectively help define the mental life and relative well-being of those, in my terminology, subjects of a life we know better as raccoons and rabbits, beaver and bison, chipmunks and chimpanzees, you and I. Line-drawing challenges arise for anyone who believes that not all animals are subjects of a life. Amoeba and paramecia, for example, are in the world but not aware of it. Where exactly on the phylogenetic scale do subjects of a life appear? I have always believed that no one knows the exact answer, and I personally have never tried to give one. Instead, I adopt a conservative policy by asking whether a line can be drawn that minimizes otherwise endless disputation. The line I draw is mentally normal mammals of a year or more. Wherever we draw the relevant line, these animals are above it. This is what I mean when I say the policy I adopt is conservative. How can we talk about these animals without using needlessly cumbersome language? In the case, I answer this question by stipulating that, unless otherwise indicated, the word animal will refer to mentally normal mammals of a year or more, and make this same stipulation here. Having explained these matters, I go to some length to make it as clear as I possibly can that other sorts of animals might be subjects of a life. In my most recent writings, in fact, I argue that we have abundant reason to think that birds are and that fish may be. Even so, some philosophers, apparently more interested in dismissing my conclusions than in understanding my premises, confidently informed their readers that, in my view, subjects of a life turn out to be mammals and no other form of life. The preceding considerations provide the rights view's basis for denying that human and animal welfare differ in kind. Both animals and humans, I write, have interests, some biological, some psychological, some social. The overall tone or quality of the life of each, to a greater or lesser degree, is a function of the harmonious satisfaction of those preferences that it is in the interests of each to have satisfied. Granted, the sources of satisfaction available to most humans are at once more numerous and varied than those available to animals. Even granted, in Mill's memorable words that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, nevertheless, the same categories of thought, interests, benefits, harms, etc., that illuminate the most general features of human welfare are equally applicable to animal welfare. Now, both human and non-human subjects of a life, in my view, have a basic moral right to respectful treatment. Of course, moral positions can be advanced that either dispense with rights altogether or, while affirming the rights of human beings, deny them in the case of non-human animals. But, or so I argue in chapters 5 through 7, such views prove to be deficient. For example, because they are inconsistent or needlessly complicated, because they lack precision or adequate scope, or because their implications clash with a large body of our well-considered moral beliefs, our moral intuitions. The basic moral right to respectful treatment places strict limits on how subjects of a life may be treated. Individuals who possess this right are never to be treated as if they exist as resources for others. In particular, harms intentionally done to any one subject cannot be justified by aggregating benefits derived by others. In this respect, my position is anti-utilitarian, a theory in the Kantian, not the Millian tradition. But the rights view parts company with Kant when it comes to specifying who should be treated with respect. For Kant, only moral agents exist as ends in themselves. Only those who are capable of applying abstract, impartial moral principles to their decision-making share the equal right to be treated with respect. By contrast, the rights view recognizes the equal inherent value of all subjects of a life, including those who lack the capacities necessary for moral agency. These moral patients, as I call them, have the same equal rights to respectful treatment as do moral agents. According to the rights view, therefore, non-human animals who are subjects of a life have this right as certainly as do those human subjects of a life who read these words. Thus, although I believe that human life contains within it the possibility of a richness not to be found in the life of other animals, because, for example, of our advanced cognitive, aesthetic, moral, and spiritual capacities, this difference provides absolutely no basis whatsoever for our exploitation of other animals. It is on this basis that I reach conclusions that, in Jan Narveson's cheerful words, qualify me as a starry-eyed radical. For example, since the utilization of non-human animals for purposes of fashion, research, entertainment, or gustatory delight harms them in the process of treating them as our resources, and since, given the rights view, such treatment violates their right to be treated with respect, it follows that such utilization is morally wrong and ought to end. Merely to reform such institutional injustice, by resolving to raise only happy cows or to insist on larger cages for lions in circuses, for example, is not enough. Morally considered, abolition is required. My critics are of a different mind. Indeed, if they are right, I have secured for myself, by dint of my dogged determination, so to speak, the unenviable distinction of being mistaken about everything having the slightest presumption to philosophical importance. Mistaken about the minds of animals, mistaken about how to evaluate moral theories, mistaken about what rights are and who has them, mistaken about what our moral duties are, even mistaken about what moral philosophy is and how it should be done. With such a full plate of imputed failure, a large portion of selectivity in what I am able to consider is unavoidable. While I cannot reply to all the objections raised, I believe those to which I do reply are among the most important. Objections and replies. The appeal to intuition. How might we justify our acceptance of various moral principles? How can we rationally choose between the conflicting moral theories of which these principles are a part? Anyone familiar with the history of moral philosophy knows how divisive and controversial these questions are. In the case, I explain and attempt to defend a set of appropriate criteria for making such decisions. The criteria I deploy are consistency, precision, scope, parsimony, and conformity with our intuitions. Of these 5, the last has occasioned the most critical responses, some of which, as I shall illustrate shortly, are demonstrably ill-focused. Intuition is an ambiguous concept and a troublesome one no matter how it is understood. In the case, after explaining several ways in which others have understood it, I explain what I call the reflective sense of the idea. In the reflective sense, our intuitions are those moral beliefs we hold after we have made a conscientious effort to think about our beliefs coolly, rationally, impartially, with conceptual clarity, and with as much relevant information as we can reasonably acquire. The judgments we make after we have made this effort are not our gut responses, nor are they merely expressions of what we happen to believe. They are our considered beliefs. To test alternative moral principles by how well they conform with our reflective intuitions is thus to test them against our considered beliefs, and other things being equal between 2 competing moral principles, that is, assuming that the 2 are equal in scope, precision, and consistency, the principle that matches our reflective intuitions best is rationally to be preferred. Having set forth how I understand intuition and explained the role it plays in my thinking, I go on to explain why some of our intuitions themselves might stand in need of revision or even abandonment if, as is possible, they conflict with principles that are otherwise validated. What we seek, in other words, is what John Rawls refers to as reflective equilibrium between our intuitions on the one hand and our organizing general principles on the other. Moreover, and here my theory becomes even more complicated than Rawls's, I also explain why, given the ideal background conditions for arriving at our considered moral beliefs, impartiality, rationality, etc., a proper humility should lead us to understand how elusive moral knowledge is. In my view, in sum, while we can be rationally justified in accepting some moral principles and rejecting others, because we have done all that we can be reasonably expected to do by way of evaluating the competitors, it does not follow that the principles we select are true. What we can know, rather, is that we have done our best to evaluate the competing principles fully and fairly, with a view to deciding which ones best satisfy the appropriate criteria, including the test of conforming with our moral intuitions. However, because satisfying the criteria mentioned above represents an ideal that might never be fully realized, we never will be in a position to claim to know that the principles we accept and the general theory of which they are a part are in fact true, their competitors false. For his part, Narveson is unhappy with my appeal to our moral intuitions. Sometimes his consternation has my ideas as its object. More often, the objections he raises are not objections against my views, expressed or implied. For example, Narveson at one point makes light of my supposed belief that the property of inherent value is something I intuit, while at another place he takes exception to my supposed view that deciding who possesses inherent value is a matter of moral perception. Now, this may be an accurate way to characterize G.E. Moore's position regarding our acquaintance with, in his theory, the simple, unique, non-natural property of intrinsic goodness. And it is true that I have written rather extensively about Moore's philosophy. But what Narveson says in the passages to which I have just alluded is manifestly an inaccurate way to characterize my views. Properties, whatever they are not intuited in my view, and neither are our intuitions a matter of moral perception, whatever that is. To suppose otherwise is to do battle with someone other than the author of the case for animal rights. Narveson is not always this ill-focused in his understanding of how I understand moral intuitions. He writes, correctly, that when I appeal to intuitions, I am referring to reflective intuitions, a la Sidgwick, Ross, and Rawls, rather than sheer seat-of-the-pants pronouncements. Even so, Narveson believes that the appeal to intuition, when used as a test for choosing between competing moral principles, is theoretically bankrupt. Why? Because, he objects, two mutually contradictory proposed moral principles could each pass it. Passing this test, he asserts, therefore can't be sufficient as a basis for justifying our acceptance of one moral principle rather than another. It should be plain from the argument above, however, that I never assert or imply that conformity with our considered moral beliefs is a sufficient condition for choosing between moral principles or theories. The appeal to our intuitions is only one among a set of criteria of evaluation I employ, and it is no objection to this position to insist, as Narveson does, that passing this test can't be sufficient. Still, it is appropriate to ask whether conformity with our moral intuitions should play any role in our evaluation of moral principles. Narveson thinks not. Our intuitions, he seems to think, just as likely as not represent the dominant cultural biases of our time, place, and circumstances. As such, they should not be relied upon to do any heavy lifting when we turn to the serious business of theory evaluation. For my part, I am not convinced that this is a mistake. Recall that the intuitions to which we are to appeal are moral beliefs we form or retain after we have made a conscientious effort to think about them rationally, coolly, and impartially, assuming we understand the concepts involved and assuming we have secured as much relevant information as it is reasonable to demand. These conditions, as I am at pains to explain, set forth an ideal that, imperfect creatures that we are, none of us may ever fully realize. Given my view, then, as I noted earlier, while we can be rationally justified in accepting a given theory, in part because its principles conform with our moral intuitions, it does not follow that the preferred theory is the one and only true theory. Narveson might protest that he wants more. In particular, he might want to know which theory is the one and only true theory. But if there is one thing the history of moral philosophy teaches, it is that those who think they have found the one and only true theory are just as likely to be correct as are those who, after years of toil, think they have found the one and only true snark. Which does not mean, I hasten to add for reasons already given, that we must view all moral theories as equally worthy of acceptance. To conclude my discussion of Narveson's criticisms, while I am not so brazen as to suppose that my appeals to intuition are free of potentially serious difficulties, I do not believe he has identified what these might be. The idea of inherent value. Among my most persistent critics is R.G. Frye, who argues against ascribing rights to non-human animals, and to humans, too. His is the stance of the unrepentant act utilitarian, an imperturbable partisan who, when confronted with the ghastly things his theory could permit, ranging from deceitful promises to the judicial execution of the innocent, tightens his grip on his theory rather than abandoning it. Whereas the confidence of some philosophers might be shaken when it is pointed out that their favorite theory could, literally, have murderous consequences, Frye's commitment to utilitarianism does not waver. Fry does more than deny rights to animals. He also denies animals all but the faintest trace of mind. Sensations, some pleasant, some painful, he concedes they experience. But that's about it. Barren of preferences, wants, and desires, lacking memory and expectation, unable to reason, plan, or intend, Fry's conception of the mental life of non-human animals comes within a whisker, so to speak, of Descartes. I address this aspect of Fry's work in The Case, and will not repeat my criticisms here. Instead, I limit my discussion to his criticisms of an idea that is central to the right's view, the idea of inherent value. To understand what this idea means and how it functions in my theory, inherent value needs to be seen in the larger context of the other sorts of values that play a role in the right's view. These values include 1. Well-being, understood as quality of life or welfare. 2. Intrinsic values, including various mental states such as pleasure and satisfaction. 3. Utility, understood either as what is useful as a means, as what exists as a resource relative to someone's purposes or interests, or as the aggregation of values such as welfare or pleasure. 4. Uniquely human values, including the satisfaction of aesthetic, scientific, and sacramental interests. 5. Merit or excellence. 6. The value of a life, understood by asking how much is lost, how much harm is done when individuals die. And 7. Inherent value, understood as a kind of value possessed by certain individuals, after the fashion of Kant's idea of individuals existing as ends in themselves. Concerning inherent value, I argue 4 things. First, while an ethical theory would be simpler if it would dispense with this kind of value, simplicity isn't everything. In order to have the best theory, all considered, I argue that we must postulate inherent value. Second, inherent value is logically distinct from, is not reducible to, and is not a function of the other kinds of values previously mentioned. An individual's moral status as one who possesses inherent value is logically independent of how happy she is, how talented or deserving, how useful, and so on. Third, inherent value is a categorical concept. An individual either has it, or that individual does not. And all those who have inherent value have this value equally. Fourth, all those individuals who are subjects of a life, as this concept was explained in the preceding, have inherent value and thus enjoy an equal moral status, the subject of a life criterion constituting a sufficient condition for the possession of such value. Many are the critics who have taken exception to the idea of inherent value. Fry, who disputes the idea itself as well as its alleged equality, is chief among them. Concerning the former, Fry informs his readers that he does not regard all human life as of equal value. I do not accept, he writes, that a very severely mentally enfeebled human, or an elderly human fully in the grip of senile dementia, or an infant born with only half a brain, has a life whose value is equal to that of normal adult humans. The quality of human life can plummet to a point where we would not wish that life on even our worst enemies, and I see no reason to pretend that a life I would not wish upon even my worst enemies is nevertheless as valuable as the life of any normal adult human. It will be noticed that, in the passage just quoted, Fry refers to the quality of human life, and to the fact that the quality of human life can vary from individual to individual, sometimes plummeting to an unquestionably undesirable level indeed. It should be clear, then, that by challenging my position in the way he does, Fry has confused the idea of inherent value with the very different idea of individual welfare. To speak of quality of life is to refer to how well an individual's life is faring, while to speak of the inherent value of an individual is to refer to the value of the individual whose life it is. Human subjects of a life who are confused, enfeebled or otherwise disadvantaged, let us agree, have a life that is of a lesser quality than those who realize the highest level on Maslow's scale of self-actualization. But this does not entail that human subjects of a life with a poorer quality of life lack inherent value. Not for a moment do I deny that the experiential welfare of different individuals can vary greatly. But as I have never said or implied that quality of life is everywhere the same, Fry's insistence that it can differ fails as a criticism against my position. The same is true of what Fry has to say about my views regarding the equality of inherent value. After first, falsely attributing to me the position that all human life, however deficient, has the same value, he then goes on to say, I, Fry, do not agree. For me, the value of life is a function of its quality a function of its richness, and its richness a function of its scope or potentiality for enrichment, and the fact is that many humans lead lives of a very much lower quality than ordinary human lives which lack enrichment, and where the potentialities for enrichment are severely truncated or absent. Once again, however, Fry does not so much challenge my views as miss what they are. First, I do not state or imply that all human life has the same value, including the same inherent value. This because inherent value is possessed by individual subjects of a life, not by the life these subjects have. Second, while in my view all humans who satisfy the subject of a life criterion have inherent value and have it equally, it does not follow that the value of their life, any more than its quality, is equal. In short, given my theory of value, the quality of an individual's life is one thing. The value of the one whose life it is another. Since Frey treats the two ideas as if, in my theory, they are one and the same, his protestations misfire. I will have more to say about the different value different lives can have in the section Evaluating Lives. Moral agents and moral patience. Earlier, I observed that, with few exceptions, philosophers who have challenged belief in animal rights have done so respectfully. Carl Cohen is among the exceptions. By way of example, people who believe in animal rights are said by him to be out of their mind, while what we believe is characterized as silly, absurd, preposterous, a fanatical conviction, a popular slogan for the ignorant. The belief in any sort of moral equality shared by humans and animals, this he describes as preposterous and absurd. As unprofessional as they are, Cohen's rhetorical broadsides aimed at me are tame by comparison to those I have just summarized. Readers of The Case, he writes, will find my book long and tortuous and in places obscure. The arguments in its pages largely smoke, the argument for animal rights utterly fallacious, profoundly mistaken, dreadfully unsound, entirely unpersuasive, its central conclusion reached with almost magical speed. To anyone who might still be tempted to open its pages, Cohen offers his assurance that there is no argument or set of arguments in the case for animal rights that successfully makes the case for animal rights. Much could be said in response to Cohen's meretricious rhetoric. My words will be few. Philosophical discussion, whatever the topic, has no place for name-calling or insulting invective. Not only do we fail to prove our point by saying bad things about our opponents, and not only do we besmirch our own reputation when we do so, more importantly, we risk giving philosophy a bad name, thereby lessening the standing of our professional peers within the larger community of scholars. Out of respect for our colleagues, then, if for no other reason, philosophers should abstain on principle from engaging in the regrettable excess that characterizes so much of Cohen's work. In addition to his displeasure over the alleged speed with which the conclusion of my argument for animal rights is reached, Cohen also is disturbed because the argument, by his lights, turns on a single principle, which, quoting from The Case, he identifies as follows: the validity of the claim to respectful treatment and thus the case for recognition of the right to such treatment cannot be any stronger or weaker in the case of moral patients than it is in the case of moral agents. Now, there is no denying that I do say this, or that what I say here, henceforth referred to as my summary principle, summarizes the conclusion towards which my cumulative argument has been leading. So Cohen is correct in recognizing the importance of this passage, but his interpretation of what my summary principle means is more than seriously mistaken. Who are the moral agents to whom I refer? Who the moral patients? Remarkably, Cohen interprets my understanding of moral agents to be equivalent to human beings, and my understanding of moral patients to be equivalent to animals. Here is the relevant portion of the relevant quote. Regan's case for animal rights is built entirely on one principle. What principle is that? It is the principle by which moral agents, humans, and moral patients, animals, are held unconditionally equal. What Cohen says here is more than not true. It is beyond being false, attributing to me, as it does, equivalencies I not only deny, but ones I deny repeatedly. Nothing could be clearer, even to those who read my work in the most superficial manner, than that in my hands, moral patient is not equivalent to animal, and moral agent is not equivalent to human being. Indeed, one of the main objectives of my argument, both in the case and throughout my other writings on the rights of animals, is to show that these pairs of concepts are not equivalent. Why not? Because, 1, many human beings, for example, the newly born and the soon-to-be-born, are not moral agents. That is, in their present condition, they cannot apply abstract moral principles to their decision-making. And because, 2, these human beings, in my view, are moral patients. That is, in their present condition, duties are owed to them directly, the duty to be treated with respect paramount among them. Granted, someone might object to my position by arguing that all human beings are moral agents, which is false, or that no humans are moral patients, which also is false. But it is one thing to challenge my position, quite another, accurately, to say what my position is. Because he fails to do the latter, Cohen fails to do the former. The charge of equivocation. Cohen also lodges a logical objection against the rights view. My case for animal rights, he declares, is utterly fallacious because it involves an egregious example of the fallacy of equivocation, that informal fallacy in which 2 or more meanings of the same word or phrase are confused in the several propositions of an argument. The equivocation of which I am said to be guilty involves the expression inherent value, concerning which Cohen distinguishes 2 meanings. The first is moral in nature, the second is not. According to Cohen, my argument for attributing inherent value to animals, and thus my case for their rights, is utterly fallacious, dreadfully unsound, etc., because it involves an unmarked shift from one meaning of inherent value to another. What are the 2 meanings in question? The morally neutral sense is said to mean that each living creature is unique and irreplaceable. As for the moral sense of inherent value, Cohen provides the following. Regan argues that the real value of human beings must rest not in their experiences but in themselves. It is not the pleasures and pains that go into the cup of humanity that give value, but the cups themselves. All humans are, in a deep sense, equal in value because of what they are, moral agents having inherent value. What Cohen says here is true, if true at all, of someone other than the author of The Case for Animal Rights. Nowhere do I use inherent value to mean that each living creature is unique and irreplaceable. Nowhere do I maintain that all humans are in a deep sense equal in value because each is a moral agent. On my view, billions of human subjects of a life have not been, are not now, or never will be moral agents. Facts that in no way undermine their having inherent value that is equal to the inherent value possessed by those human subjects of a life who are moral agents. It must be false, therefore, that I equivocate in the manner in which Cohen says I do, and it is, in any event, false that I equivocate at all. Duties of assistance. Any fully developed moral theory is obliged to consider what we owe to others by way of assistance. In the case for animal rights, I argue that we do not exhaust our duties just by seeing to it that we have not personally violated the rights of others. We also have a prima facie duty to assist those individuals who are victims of injustice, those individuals, in other words, who have had their rights violated. Dale Jamieson challenges what he takes to be some of the implications of this part of my theory, noting that, in my view, only moral agents can violate another's rights. He argues that, although according to Regan we are required to assist those who are victims of injustice, we are not required to help those in need who are not victims of injustice. He refers to my discussion of various wildlife issues and quotes the following passage from the case. In claiming that we have a prima facie duty to assist those animals whose rights are violated, we are not claiming that we have a duty to assist the sheep against the attack of the wolf, since the wolf neither can nor does violate anyone's rights. Jamieson then argues that my position regarding duties of assistance has counterintuitive consequences. For example, we have no duty to warn a fellow hiker that a free-falling boulder is heading his way. Why not? Because, reasons Jamieson, the rights view holds that we are not required to help those in need who are not victims of injustice, and free-falling boulders, whatever else might be said of them, are not agents of injustice. Despite its initial appearance as a serious objection, I do not think Jamieson's criticism stands up. A careful reading of the relevant passages shows that I do not say what he imagines that I do. In cases where no one's rights are violated, I say we do not owe anything to anyone because an injustice has been done. And this, of course, is very different from saying we have no other duty to anyone, period. Nothing in the rights view prevents it from recognizing a general prima facie duty of beneficence, one that enjoins us to do good for others independent of considerations about what we owe to one another on the grounds of justice. In particular, nothing in the rights view prevents it from agreeing with Jamieson that, yes, we have a prima facie obligation to warn the hiker about the free-falling boulder, even though free-falling boulders violate no one's rights. Why would Jamieson think otherwise? The most plausible explanation, I think, finds me at least partly to blame. The only duties of assistance I discuss in the case are those duties of assistance we have to victims of injustice. A natural inference some readers might make is that these are the only duties of assistance the rights view can recognize. Jamieson, I believe, makes this inference. But while it may be natural, the inference is mistaken. The rights view can consistently recognize a general prima facie duty of beneficence that, in some circumstances, imposes actual duties of assistance. That such duties are not discussed in the case is a symptom of the incompleteness of the theory developed there. In hindsight, I recognize that it would have been better had I said more about the duties of assistance, other than those owed to the victims of injustice. If I had, I would have noted, most emphatically, that the duty of beneficence has important limitations. In particular, we are never to promote the good of some by violating the rights of others. In this respect, according to the rights view, the demands of justice always take precedence over the claims of beneficence. Lifeboat cases and the charge of inconsistency. If the case has a central thesis, it is the respect principle, according to which all subjects of a life, both human and non-human, share the fundamental right to be treated with respect. From this, it follows that no subject of a life may be harmed merely on the grounds that others will benefit. The obligation to respect the rights of the individual trumps any obligation we might have to promote the social good. But there is more to the rights view than the respect principle. Situations arise, I call them prevention cases, in which, no matter what we decide to do, and even if we decide to do nothing, an innocent subject of a life will be harmed. What should we do when we find ourselves in such circumstances? It is not enough to be told that every subject of a life has an equal right to be treated with respect. Though true, this does not tell us what we should do when we are faced with the daunting task of having to choose between various alternatives, each of which will harm one or more innocent subjects of a life. Let me first summarize how I think we should resolve a certain class of such conflicts. Then I will reply to several criticisms that have been raised against my proposal. A simple case involving only two individuals, M and N, illustrates how the rights view attempts to resolve prevention cases of a certain kind. Quoting from the case, "To say that M and N have an equal right not to be harmed based on the equal respect each is owed does not imply that each and every harm either may suffer is equally harmful. Other things being equal, M's death is a greater harm than N's migraine. If we are to show equal respect for the value and rights of individuals, therefore, we cannot count a lesser harm to N as equal to or greater than a greater harm to M. To show equal respect for the equal rights of the two, one must count their equal harms equally, not their unequal harms equally, a requirement that entails, other things being equal, that M's right overrides N's, in the case as described. Of course, no one should look lightly upon the harm we cause to any innocent. The more we can avoid doing this, the better. But the contingencies of the life being what they are, sometimes causing harm to the innocent cannot be prevented. Now, numbers make no difference according to the rights view. If instead of having to cause M's death or N's migraine, we had to choose between causing M's death or causing 10 or 100 or 1,000,000 migraines, then, special considerations aside, the rights view requires that we choose the latter option. For there is no individual, O, who suffers the 10 or the 100 or the 1,000,000 migraines. There is only the harm that death would be for M compared with the harm that having a migraine would be for each of the 10 or the 100 or the 1,000,000 N's. And in each case, M's death is a greater harm than anyone's migraine. Essentially, this same line of reasoning underlies how I treat lifeboat cases in the case. The situation we are to imagine is as follows. 5 survivors find themselves in a lifeboat. 4 are normal adult human beings. The 5th survivor is a dog. The boat only has room for 4. Someone must go or all will perish. Who should it be? Special considerations aside, I think it should be the dog. And I think it should be the dog because I believe that death for any of the human survivors would cause a greater harm than death would in the case of the dog. For while both the dog and each of the humans would lose everything, if either died, I believe that the everything each of the humans would lose comes to more than the everything that would be lost by the dog. Why? Because the loss that death represents is a function of the number and variety of possible sources of satisfaction it forecloses. Thus, if it is true that death for any one of the humans represents a greater loss of such possibility than would be true for the dog, death for any of the humans would be a greater harm than the death would be for the dog, which is why, in these tragic circumstances, it is the dog who should be sacrificed. Moreover, numbers make no difference. If the choice we faced were between not 1 dog and 4 humans, but between 4 humans and 10 or 100 or 1,000,000 dogs, it would be the dogs who should be sacrificed. For there is no individual, O, who is harmed by the deaths of the 10 dogs or the 100 or the 1,000,000. There is only the harm that death would be for each of the humans compared with the harm that death would be for each of the 10 or the 100 or the 1,000,000 dogs. And, in each case, the death of any one of the human beings would represent a greater harm, because a greater loss, than death would be for each of the 10 or the 100 or the 1,000,000 dogs. With the above serving as backdrop, what I call the worse-off principle should be intelligible. The principle states, special considerations aside, when we must decide to override the rights of the many or the rights of the few who are innocent, And when the harm faced by the few would make them worse off than any of the many would be if any other options were chosen, then we ought to override the rights of the many. As I hope is clear, my resolution of lifeboat cases where 10 or 100 or 1,000,000 dogs are cast overboard is neither more nor less than a particular application of the worse-off principle to the type of prevention case we have been discussing. On several occasions in the case, I caution against the temptation to generalize on the basis of our thinking in lifeboat cases. For example, I note that what the rights view implies should be done in exceptional cases, and prevention cases, including lifeboat cases, are exceptional cases, cannot fairly be generalized to unexceptional cases. As we shall soon see, a number of my critics have ignored these words of caution. My treatment of lifeboat cases has given rise to something like a cottage industry of objections, not all of which can be considered here. Personally, I think the attention showered upon my treatment of such cases is vastly disproportionate to their importance within my general theory. For this reason, I hesitate to say anything more on this topic, concerned that, by doing so, I might breathe new life into an issue that should be allowed to enjoy a quiet death. But lest it seem that I am trying to avoid some really serious objections, I will take the risk. L.W. Sumner is among those who level a charge of inconsistency. If, as I do, I would favor sacrificing 1,000,000 dogs on a lifeboat to save a single, normal, adult human being, then, Sumner alleges, I cannot consistently oppose using 1 or 1,000,000 animals in research, when doing so will save 1 or more human lives. My carefully constructed framework, Sumner charges, is inconsistent with my abolitionist conclusions. Sumner is mistaken on several counts. Suppose a critic challenges my resolution of the lifeboat case by arguing that I am committed to an animal control policy that would have us round up all the dogs in the world and dump them in the ocean. The rest of us would realize, I think, that this is very far from anything I say or anything I am committed to. My imaginary critic would be guilty of erroneously generalizing from what I think should be done in exceptional cases, sacrifice the dog in the lifeboat case, to what I think should be done as a matter of course, drown every dog. One of Sumner's mistakes is similar. Lifeboat cases invite us to consider what we should do in exceptional cases. Using animals in research is not exceptional. Using them for this purpose is very much an everyday occurrence. Literally hundreds of millions of animals are used for this purpose throughout the world, year in and year out. To suppose that I must support having millions of animals used in research because of how I adjudicate prevention cases in lifeboats is fully analogous to supposing that I am committed to rounding up millions of dogs and dumping them in the ocean because of this same adjudication. I am no more committed to the former than I am committed to the latter. More fundamentally, animals who are in laboratories already have had their rights violated, already have been treated with a lack of respect. How otherwise could they be there? When it comes to the survivors on the lifeboat, by contrast, the scenario functions as a prevention case only if we assume that no one's rights have been violated. Not the dog's rights, and not the human's rights either. Sumner cannot be correct, therefore, when he charges me with being inconsistent, because I both oppose all vivisection, where the rights of animals are violated, and at the same time, sometimes, in some lifeboat cases, for example, where no one's rights have been violated, accept the sacrifice of an animal's life in order to save a human's. Peter Singer also weighs in on the side of those who charge me with inconsistency. If I am willing to have a dog thrown overboard in order to save a human life, he thinks I should be willing to experiment on a diseased dog in order to save humans who suffer from the same illness. However, if I am willing to allow experimentation in this case, then I cannot consistently claim to be anti-vivisectionist, someone opposed to all research using animals. Like Sumner, Singer fails to recognize the moral disanalogies between lifeboats and research laboratories. None of the survivors on the lifeboat is there because his or her rights were violated. None is there as a result of being treated with a lack of respect. As soon as we enter a laboratory in which animals are experimented upon, however, the moral scene changes dramatically. When one solitary animal is brought into a laboratory, there to be used in pursuit of human benefits, that animal's right to be treated with respect has been violated. Once this much is recognized, Singer's charge of inconsistency has no traction. It is not inconsistent to adopt my view in lifeboat cases and to oppose vivisection in all cases. Rem B. Edwards provides the final example of a critic who charges me with inconsistency. To set the stage, in my view, vivisection is both coercive and wrong by its very nature. When it comes to vivisection, animals do not just happen to find themselves in a laboratory. They are there because researchers have willfully and deliberately placed them in these circumstances. Moreover, the researchers have done this with a view to utilizing these animals in the pursuit of benefits for others. Reasons Edwards, Regan's seafaring dog, his name for the dog in the original lifeboat case, did not volunteer to go to sea. Thus, as is true of animals used in research, the dog also was coerced to go to sea by the dog's human caretaker. However, since coercion is present both in how animals are treated in research and in the lifeboat case, and since I find nothing wrong with the human caretaker coercing his dog to take a sea voyage, Edwards maintains that I cannot consistently object when researchers use coercion to conduct experiments on dogs in their laboratories. Myself, I think Edwards is badly confused. Myself, I do not see coercion in every place Edwards finds it. For example, I do not think we act coercively towards dogs when we decide when and what they will be fed. Granted, we are the ones who make these decisions for them. And granted, coercion involves making decisions for someone else. But not all cases of making decisions for someone else are cases of coercion. Because, as we are imagining, the human caretaker decides to take his dog along on a sea voyage, and because in doing so the human caretaker makes this decision for the dog, it does not follow that the caretaker has coerced the dog to make the voyage. Only a confused understanding of coercion would make the opposite inference seem plausible. But let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that we always act coercively with respect to animals whenever we make decisions for them. Then we can ask whether all cases of coercion represent violations of rights. I do not think they do. Myself, I do not think we violate the rights of dogs every time we decide when or what they will be fed. Nor do I think that the human caretaker necessarily violates the rights of the seafaring dog when he decides to take the dog with him on his journey. By contrast, I do think researchers violate the rights of dogs when they decide to place them in a laboratory, there to be used as tools or models for purposes of research. Even conceding Edwards' distorted understanding of coercion, it is not inconsistent to permit one type of coercion, the type that does not involve violations of rights, and to prohibit another type of coercion, the type that does involve such violations. By way of concluding the present section, then, let me say the following. Mistaken I may be, both in how I resolve lifeboat cases and in my adherence to the worse-off principle, but inconsistent for the reasons Sumner, Singer, and Edwards allege? No, I do not think so. The Specter of Speciesism. Evelyn Pluhar disputes my handling of the lifeboat case for different reasons. On her view, while I avoid the charge of inconsistency, I am mistaken nonetheless. Why? Because I am committed to an unacceptable principle, UP for short. Here is how she formulates this principle. Any sentient non-human that we know of would be harmed less by death than would a human. After all, don't I argue in favor of sacrificing the dog rather than any one of the humans? Don't I argue that the harm death would be in the case of the dog would be less than the harm death would be in the case of each of the humans? So am I not committed to UP? The short answer to this last question is no. The longer answer takes longer. To begin with, consider the following variation on the lifeboat case. The lifeboat contains a dog, 3 normal adult humans, and 1 irreversibly comatose human. Since, in my analysis, death for the irreversibly comatose human represents no loss and thus no harm, and since death for any of the other humans, as well as for the dog, represents a loss or harm greater than 0, my analysis, special considerations aside, clearly would support sacrificing the irreversibly comatose human being while saving the dog and the 3 normal adults. Some people, I have no doubt, will object to my finding in this case. They will charge me with misanthropy, or worse, but at least none of these critics could plausibly object on the grounds that I am committed to UP. Nowhere do I state or imply anything that makes a blanket, universal statement about the loss that death represents for all humans compared to all other animals. From the fact, assuming it to be a fact, that in some cases death for some non-human animals represents less of a loss than it represents for some humans, it does not follow that the same is true for all animals when compared with all humans. Charges of inconsistency are serious. This is why, despite the, to my mind, disproportionate attention paid to the lifeboat case, I have felt compelled to respond to them. Even so, Pluhar's objection, if true, would be even more damaging. Why? Because it is hard to understand how anyone could accept UP and avoid the charge of speciesism. How could it be otherwise? Logically, one can believe that the loss death represents for human beings is always greater than the loss death represents for any other animal, only if one also believes that all humans, because they are human, have something of value to lose that no other animal possesses. And if this is not an instance of speciesism, what else is it? How embarrassing to have the author of The Case for Animal Rights unmasked as a closet speciesist. So let me emphasize, as strongly as I can, that nothing could be further from the truth. The loss death represents must be determined on a case-by-case basis. When it is, we will find many occasions when death represents a greater loss in the case of some animals than it does in the case of some humans. Evaluating lives. As previously noted, the rights view distinguishes between the value of the lives lived by various subjects and the value of the subjects who lived them. It is a central tenet of the rights view that all subjects of a life have the same kind of value, inherent value, and that they all possess this value equally. However, the value of the life subjects lead need not be equal, and in many cases, it seems to me, it clearly is not. Recall Fry's example of a very severely mentally enfeebled human. In the rights view's analysis, while the inherent value of the subject of this life, Fred, say, is no greater or less than the inherent value of any other subject of a life, Fry, for example, it does not follow that both Fred and Fry have lives that are equal in value. On the contrary, the rights view's analysis implies that the value of a life, like the harm represented by death, increases as the number and variety of possible sources of satisfaction increases. Thus, if it is true, as I believe it is, that Fry's life includes much more by way of possible sources of satisfaction than does Fred's life, then Fry's life has greater value than Fred's. Of course, this in no way justifies permitting Fry or philosophers as a group to exploit Fred and others like him. Nothing relating to the justice of social practices or institutions follows from anything I have said. Only in extreme cases would differences in the value of different lives matter. In a lifeboat case, for example, where we had to decide between saving Fry or saving Fred, the rights view's verdict, special considerations aside, would be to save Fry. What is true when the value of Fred's and Fry's lives are compared is also true when we compare the value of Fry's life to that of a dog, Fido, say. If it is true, as I believe it is, that Fry's life includes much more by way of possible sources of satisfaction than does Fido's life, then Fry's life has greater value than Fido's. Of course, once again, this in no way justifies permitting Fry or philosophers as a group to exploit Fido or dogs in general. Nothing relating to the justice of social practices or institutions follows from anything I have said. Only in extreme cases would differences in the value of different lives matter. In a lifeboat case, for example, where we had to decide between saving Fry or saving Fido, the rights view's verdict, special considerations aside, would be the same. We ought to save Fry. Steve Saponsis challenges my thinking here. To set the stage, suppose I am asked what possible sources of satisfaction are available to Fry that are not available to Fido. One of the first differences I would point to involves moral agency, as this idea is understood by the rights view. Fry can, whereas Fido cannot, bring impartial reasons to bear on his moral decision-making. For example, by invoking the golden rule or the principle of utility. For this reason, Fry's life has a source of satisfaction that Fido's lacks, which, given the rights view's analysis, adds to the value of Fry's life when compared to Fido's. Saponsis disagrees. The Fidos of the world, not just the Frys, he maintains, can behave virtuously. For example, Saponsis observes, we commonly attribute to animals such moral virtues as sympathy, self-sacrifice, loyalty, and courage. I have no quarrel with what Saponsis says, though I know many others will. They will say such thinking is anthropomorphic, in a disreputable sort of way. Suppose we set these worries to one side and agree, for the sake of argument, that many animals display the sorts of virtue Saponsis mentions. Of course, so do many humans. And this similarity is important. To express the similarity in the language I favor, possible sources of satisfaction, for many, not all, animals and humans, include the satisfaction that comes from acting virtuously, with sympathy, self-sacrifice, loyalty, and courage, for example. In these respects, given the rights view, the lives of animals and humans are equal in value, so Saponsis' objection is so far valid. Nevertheless, even Saponsis would agree that relevant differences remain. In particular, humans like Fry are, whereas animals like Fido are not, moral agents in the sense that is central to the rights view. We can, but other animals cannot, bring impartial reasons to bear on decision-making, for example, by applying the golden rule or the principle of utility. Thus, the possible sources of satisfaction for humans like Fry include the satisfaction available to animals like Fido, plus the satisfaction that flows from thinking impartially about moral choices, a possible source of satisfaction not available to Fido and other animals like him. More simply expressed, the possibilities are greater for humans like Fry than they are for animals like Fido. Given my analysis then, because life for humans like Fry includes more by way of possible sources of satisfaction than does life for animals like Fido, the life of these humans has greater value than the life of these animals. What is true of my reply to this particular objection raised by Saponsis will be true of my replies to other objections that challenge why I think the life of humans like Fry is of greater value than the life of animals like Fido. Yes, I will say, you, my critics, are correct. Animals really can X. For example, they really can act virtuously, really can reason, really can plan, really can communicate, and so on. But, I will add, humans like Fry can do all this and much more. For example, they can pursue aesthetic, scientific, and sacramental interests that other animals lack. Am I correct in thinking this way? And even if I am, is my analysis of the value of life correct as well? Maybe it's my working-class background that prevents me from being so arrogant as to suppose that I clearly discern what's true in these muddy waters. What I think I can see is how, consistent with the major tenets of the rights view, objections like those raised by Saponsis can be met. The rights view and predator-prey relations. In my earlier discussion of Jameson's ideas, I noted that the rights view can recognize duties of assistance grounded in a general prima facie duty of beneficence. If, as I believe, we humans have such duties to one another independent of the demands of justice, there is no reason why duties of the same kind might not arise in circumstances in which animals are involved. For example, suppose a lion is stalking a small child. If we frighten the lion, we may be able to save the child. Since lions are not moral agents in the sense in which I use this expression, no rights violation is in the offing. But the child almost certainly will be harmed if we do nothing. Should we try to prevent this outcome? Do we have a prima facie duty to intervene? It is hard to imagine how a negative answer could be defended. So let us assume, what I take to be true, that we have a prima facie duty of assistance in this case. Next, suppose the same lion is stalking not a child, but a wildebeest. And suppose, again, that if we frighten the lion, we may be able to save the wildebeest. Since lions are not moral agents in the sense in which I use this expression, no rights violation is in the offing. But the wildebeest almost certainly will be harmed if we do nothing. Should we try to prevent this outcome? Do we have a prima facie duty to intervene? The answer I give in the case is no. It did not take long for critics to think that something had gone wrong. J. Baird Callicott, one of the true pioneers in environmental ethics, is representative. In his review of the case, he writes, "If we ought to protect humans' rights not to be preyed upon by animal predators, then we ought to protect animals' rights not to be preyed upon by animal predators." And not just a little. Callicott insists that the rights view is committed to protecting prey animals a lot. In his words, Regan's theory of animal rights implies a policy of human predator extermination. Whatever else may be true, Callicott clearly overstates his diagnosis when he writes that predators, however innocently, violate the rights of their victims. Only moral agents are capable of violating rights, and non-human animals are not moral agents in the sense that is central to the rights view. Moreover, and obviously, Callicott moves uncritically from asking what should be done in particular cases to what should be done as a matter of general policy. And this is important. While we all agree, I assume, that we have a prima facie duty to protect the child from the lion, no advocate of children's rights is thereby logically committed to promulgating policies that seek to eradicate every predatory animal under the sun. Why then suppose that advocates of animal rights are committed to promulgating such policies because predatory animals harm their prey? Callicott does not say. To tar the rights view with the broad brush of eradicating wildlife, while it may make for good rhetoric, does not make for good philosophy. These matters to one side, what does the rights view say about predator-prey relations? To begin with, in the case, I adopt a position that is diametrically opposed to the one Callicott would foist upon me. Instead of advocating a policy of massive intervention in the affairs of wildlife, what we ought in general to do is nothing. Here is what I mean and why I think this way. As I note on several occasions in the case, our ruling obligation with regard to wild animals is to let them be, an obligation grounded in a recognition of their general competence to get on with the business of living, a competence that we find among members of both predator and prey species. After all, if members of prey species, including the young, were unable to survive without our assistance, there would be no prey species. And the same applies to predators. In short, we honor the competence of animals in the wild by permitting them to use their natural abilities, even in the face of their competing needs. As a general rule, they do not need help from us in their struggle for survival, and we do not fail to discharge our duty when we choose not to lend our assistance. We do not find this same competence in young children. The plain fact is they cannot take care of themselves and have no realistic hope of surviving, in the wild or in the home, if we do not help them. To let children be, therefore, is not to honor their competence. From the perspective of the rights view, therefore, there is nothing the least bit inconsistent in recognizing duties of assistance to human beings, including human children, that we do not recognize in the case of other animals, including wild animals. The same point can be made in another way. In the case, I argue that animals are capable of knowing what they want and of acting with the intention of getting it. Because they have these capacities, it is possible for us to act paternalistically toward them. Roughly speaking, paternalistic intervention in animals' lives means taking measures to prevent them from pursuing what they want because, we believe, permitting them to do so will be detrimental to their interests. When it comes to our obligations to wild animals, the rights view is unapologetically anti-paternalistic. I write, "The goal of wildlife management should be to defend wild animals in the possession of their rights, providing them with the opportunity to live their own life, by their own lights as best they can, spared that human predation that goes by the name sport." In the case of young children, our obligations differ. Someone who placed young children in the woods or on an ice floe, the better to provide them with the opportunity to live their own life by their own lights as best they can, would be judged criminally irresponsible, and rightly so. In general, we act in ways that respect the rights of wild animals by adopting an anti-paternalistic stance, just as, in general, we act in ways that respect the rights of young children if the stance we adopt is paternalistic. From the perspective of the rights view, both stances show equal respect for the rights of each group. The rights view and endangered species. Some environmental philosophers, Callcott is representative, criticize the rights view because of its failure to provide a credible basis for addressing our obligation to preserve endangered species. For simplicity's sake, I limit my attention to endangered as distinct from rare species. The logic of the objection is simple. If the rights view fails to provide a credible basis for addressing this obligation, the rights view is not the best theory, all considered. The rights view fails in this respect. Therefore, it is not the best theory, all considered. Although I believe my position is seriously challenged by this line of criticism, and although, for reasons I will explain, I now believe my discussion of endangered species in the case should have been expanded, it is not clear to me that this objection is as telling as its proponents would have us believe. Let me explain. The rights view restricts inherent value and rights to individuals. Because species are not individuals, the rights view does not recognize the rights of species to anything, including survival. Moreover, the inherent value and rights of individuals do not wax or wane depending on how plentiful or rare are the species to which they belong. Beaver are not less valuable because they are more plentiful than bison. East African black rhinos are not more valuable than rabbits because their numbers are declining. On the rights view, I write, the same principles apply to the moral assessment of rare or endangered animals as applied to those that are plentiful, and the same principles apply whether the animals in question are wild or domesticated. How, then, can the rights view address our obligation to preserve endangered species? In the case, I offer a twofold answer. First, we have an obligation, prima facie to be sure, to stop human moral agents, commercial developers, poachers, and other interested third parties, for example, whose actions violate the rights of animals. Second, we have an obligation to halt the destruction of natural habitat when that destruction makes life for these animals unsustainable. If we succeed in discharging these obligations, my discussion implies, we will succeed in discharging our duty to protect endangered species. A critic might respond by noting that the rights view fails to do justice to our intuition that we owe something more to endangered than we do to bountiful species, more to East African black rhinos than to rabbits, for example. In view of its insistence on the equal inherent value of animals, how can the rights view account for this intuition? Because this question is not asked in the case, it is not answered there. Here, in rough outline, is the sort of answer I think I would have given if the question had been asked. Compensatory justice is an idea advocates of human justice sometimes employ in analogous situations. A classic example involves past injustice done to members of identifiable groups. For example, although today's descendants of those Minneconjou Sioux who were slaughtered by the 7th U.S. Cavalry at Wounded Knee on December 29, 1890, were not alive at the time of the massacre, it is not implausible to argue that they, today's descendants, are owed something because of what happened not only at Wounded Knee, but also for many years before and after. Any reasonable view of history would admit that today's descendants have been disadvantaged because of the massive injustice done to their ancestors. Moreover, what they are owed is something more than what is owed to others of us who have not been disadvantaged in similar ways for similar reasons. Other things being equal, more should be done for them by way of compensatory assistance than what is done for others. The rights view can apply compensatory principles to animals, the East African black rhino, for example, whose numbers are in severe decline because of past wrongs, for example, poaching of ancestors and destruction of habitat. Although the remaining rhinos have no greater inherent value than the members of a more plentiful species, rabbits, say, the assistance owed to the former arguably is greater than that owed to the latter. If it is true, as I believe it is, that today's rhinos have been disadvantaged because of wrongs done to their predecessors, then, other things being equal, more should be done for rhinos by way of compensatory assistance than should be done for rabbits. In such manner, I believe, the rights view can account for our intuition that we owe more to the members of endangered species of animals than we owe to the members of more plentiful species. I failed to make this argument in the case, which I regret, just as I regret that, because of the limits of space, if for no other reason, I can offer only a crude sketch of this argument here. Critics of the rights view may point out that the vast majority of endangered species consists of plants and insects, forms of life too rudimentary to qualify as subjects of a life. In their case, because they possess no rights, nothing can be owed to them for reasons of compensatory justice. Worse, it will be claimed, the continued existence of many of these plants and insects is not necessary to sustain the life of those animals who are subjects of a life. What can the rights view say about our obligation to preserve these endangered species? What can be said, I think, is what the case already says, only now extended to the forms of life under review. The rights view, I write, does not deny, nor is it antagonistic to recognizing the importance of aesthetic, scientific, sacramental, and other human interests in preserving endangered species. What the rights view denies, at least in its current articulation, is that plants and insects are subjects of a life. And it denies as well that these forms of life have been shown to have any rights, including a right to survival. Of course, there is nothing wrong in principle if we make great efforts to preserve such lives, based on human aesthetic or sacramental interests, for example. But agreeing that we may, in principle, do this stops well short of establishing that plants and insects have a valid claim on us that we do so. Environmental philosophers in general, including the most distinguished among them, will not be satisfied with the environmental implications of the rights view, whether augmented by principles of compensatory justice or not. They will say, and in fact some have said, that species have inherent value. and so do ecosystems and the biosphere, which is how we should account for our obligation to save endangered species, including plants and insects, not just fuzzy mammals. To which I can only make the following response. It is not enough to confer inherent or intrinsic value on species, ecosystems, or the biosphere. One wants a compelling argument for doing so. Not only has this not been done, for reasons I have given elsewhere, I believe it cannot be done. Patriarchy and animal rights. Some feminist theorists, liberal feminists as they are called, believe in human rights. Other feminist theorists, influenced by the work of Carol Gilligan, are of a different mind. They believe that rights talk is symptomatic of patriarchal modes of thinking. As paradoxical as this might sound, these feminists, I call them ethic of care feminists, argue that belief in animal rights perpetuates patriarchy, understood as the unfounded belief in male superiority. Let me say something about patriarchal modes of thought as they are described in this context. Then we can perhaps better understand how this type of criticism of the rights view works. Owing to a variety of cultural forces, ethic of care feminists maintain men tend to think in certain ways, women in others. To begin with, men, but not women, tend to think in dualistic hierarchical terms. For example, men tend to view reason as standing over against emotion, a dualism, and also tend to think that reason is the superior of the two, a hierarchy. This same pattern emerges in the case of objectivity and subjectivity, impartiality and partiality, justice and care, culture and nature, and individualism and communitarianism. In each of these and other cases, the world tends to be carved up by men into dualistic terms, and in each such case, one of the two terms is ranked higher as being of greater importance or value than its opposite. What these theorists would term male mind, then, is characterized by dualistic hierarchical rankings, a summary of which would read as follows. Men tend to believe that reason, objectivity, impartiality, justice, culture, and individualism are of greater importance or value than emotion, subjectivity, partiality, care, nature, and community. More than this, men tend to think that men are characterized by the higher-ranked pair in each of the dualisms, and women by the lower. Thus, women are supposed by men to be less rational and more emotional, less objective and more subjective, and so on. With the preceding serving as logical backdrop, the denunciation of individual rights voiced by ethic of care feminists is intelligible. The idea of the rights of the individual, they believe, is a product of male mind. Why? Because it grows out of a conception of the world that places greater value on the separateness of the individual. Rights, after all, belong to individuals, over against familial and communitarian relationships. Moreover, views that affirm individual rights place greater importance on evaluating moral choices in terms of impartial considerations, such as the right to respectful treatment, than on making evaluations based on our responsibility to nurture and sustain close interpersonal relationships, such as the relationships that obtain between parents and their children. The moral significance of these latter relationships is denigrated by male mind. Nurturing is women's work, and thus of less importance than the acts or policies that honor the universal, equal, inalienable rights of the individual. Against this judgment, ethic of care feminists celebrate the qualities, emotion, subjectivity, and an ethic of care, for example, traditionally associated with the feminine. The objections these feminists raise against the rights view all follow the same logical pattern. Patriarchal modes of thought are first characterized in terms of certain traits, A, B, C. The rights view is said to have traits A, B, C. Therefore, the rights view is denounced as patriarchal. Deborah Slicer, for example, writes that the rights view is typical of the justice tradition. It perpetuates our culture's objectionable use of dualistic hierarchies. It embodies a masculine sense of the self. For example, insofar as it incorporates a masculinist contempt for our emotions. It would have us worship principles while neglecting such things as virtues and the affections. The rights view is said to grossly oversimplify the moral issues it aspires to address. In some cases, its teachings are dangerously misleading. In much the same mode, Josephine Donovan writes disparagingly of my determined exclusion of sentiment from serious intellectual inquiry, of how the rights view privileges rationalism and individualism, and of why what is needed is a critique of the atomistic individualism and rationalism of the liberal tradition, a vision that emphasizes collectivity, emotional bonding, and an organic or holistic concept of life. When all the dust settles, the philosophy one gets in the case for animal rights is, in Donovan's judgment, biased. In a previously published paper, I have offered my critique of the empirical evidence, there is very little, if any, used to support belief in male mind, and of the logical hurdles, insurmountable in my view, any ethic of care must face. I will not repeat my criticisms here. Instead, I invite others to consider how fair these ethic of care feminists are in their efforts to understand and characterize the views they attribute to me. A few examples will show that fairness sometimes is a scarce commodity. My views are said to display the masculinist contempt for emotion. The sole evidence given for this judgment is my insistence that the case for animal rights I present relies on reason, not emotion. How could it be otherwise? How could one conceivably offer a theory of animal rights based on appeals to emotion? What could such a theory possibly maintain? It hardly expresses contempt for emotion to believe that emotion has its limits, and it is the thesis that emotion has its limits, not contempt for emotion, that one finds in my work. Consider further the following passage from an essay of mine that has been widely available since 1985. There are times, and these not infrequent, when tears come to my eyes when I see or read or hear of the wretched plight of animals in the hands of humans. Their pain, their suffering, their loneliness, their innocence, their death, anger, rage, pity, sorrow, disgust. It is our hearts, not just our heads, that call for an end to it all. How, I wonder, can anyone read a passage like this and criticize me for harboring a masculinist contempt for emotion? I am said to offer an approach to ethics that worships principles while neglecting such things as virtue or the affections, despite the fact that I have published a lengthy refutation of utilitarianism based on this theory's inability to account for the great value friendship has in human life. And so it goes. I do not claim that Slicer, Donovan, and other ethic of care critics of my position willfully or maliciously misrepresent my ideas. I claim only that they do misrepresent them. By itself, of course, this does not make my ideas any more credible than they otherwise might be, but it does, I think, go some way towards explaining why I do not believe the feminist critique of the rights view is compelling enough to require its rejection. Conclusion. The first edition of the Case for Animal Rights used a quote by John Stuart Mill as its motto. Every great movement, he writes, must experience 3 stages: ridicule, discussion, adoption. Mill's quote retains its pride of place in this second edition. I could not have described the book's aspirations any better. In concert with the efforts of others, I hoped the case would move animal rights past the stage of ridicule to that of discussion. In my heart of hearts, however, my more profound hope was that the publication of this book will play some role in advancing this great movement, the animal rights movement, toward the third and final stage, the stage of adoption. Has the case helped increase discussion of animal rights? It is hard to know. The past 2 decades have seen an enormous change in the frequency with which the idea of animal rights is addressed, especially in philosophy. It is no exaggeration to say that philosophers have written more about animal rights in the past 20 years than our predecessors wrote in the previous 2,000. I like to think the case has made some contribution to this revolutionary development. Adoption of animal rights is another matter. Tragically, we find the same injustices today as were present in 1983. Billions of animals slaughtered for their flesh. Baby seals bludgeoned to death on the ice. Greyhounds kept in crates for 23 hours a day, even as greyhound racing flourishes. Wild animals deprived of their very being as they are taught to perform tricks in circuses and at marine parks. So many wrongs remain to be righted. Realistically, we are light years away from creating a culture in which the rights of animals are respected. Nevertheless, signs of positive change give hope for a better future. Take the U.S. fur industry, for example. As recently as the mid-1980s, 20 million animals were trapped annually for their fur. Today, the number stands at 4 million. During this same period, the number of active trappers has been cut in half, from 330,000 to 165,000. And the number of mink ranches has declined at an even greater rate, from 1,000 to slightly over 300. While the number of animals slaughtered for food has increased, overall, per capita, meat consumption has declined. Consumption of veal in the United States, for example, is less than half of what it was 20 years ago. 2.7 million slaughtered then, 800,000 now. Even the rate at which Americans kill lost or unwanted companion animals has shown meaningful improvement. 23.4 million in 1970, 17.8 million in 1985, and 4.2 million in 2002. Because exact numbers are hard to come by, no one can say with certainty how many animals are used in education, testing, and research throughout the United States. However, the total number of tracked species, rodents, birds, and farmed animals are not covered by our Animal Welfare Act, is significantly lower than it was in 1985, 2,153,787 then, 1,236,903 now. So, yes, some evidence suggests that positive change is occurring, though at a much slower rate than I imagined when I finished the case. A few weeks after the final manuscript had been mailed to the publisher, I remember walking the cold December streets of New York, jostled by the holiday crowds, thinking that in every stranger's face I saw a future animal rights advocate. I looked forward to the glorious day when the case for animal rights would transform America, the world even, into a safe haven for animals, a place where, at long last, they would be treated with respect. Talk about being mistaken. Not only did I greatly overestimate the power of the case, I greatly underestimated the many challenges standing in the way of society's full acceptance of animal rights. If I have learned anything in the past 20 years, it is that the struggle for animal rights is not for the faint of heart. The pace of social change requires the plodding endurance of the marathoner, not the lightning speed of the sprinter. My belief in the ultimate triumph of justice for other animals is no less today than it was when I made my way through the currents of those holiday shoppers. If anything, it is stronger. Let's just say my idealism has been tempered by a strong dose of realism. As for my overestimation of the power of the case, I am embarrassed to confess my naivete. I don't know what possessed me to think that a book in moral theory could change the world. I do know, as I mentioned earlier, that I was in the process of coming down from a creative high unique in my life, evidence for which survives in the inordinate amount of italicization in the text. Since I was so excited, perhaps I thought that everyone reading the case would be too. Perhaps I thought that, since I had been transformed as I wrote these pages, others would be no less transformed as they read them. In any event, I think differently today. People need to do more than be convinced by a philosophical argument for the rights of animals. In particular, they need to come to terms with what really is happening to animals, something they will never do if they trust what they are told by spokespersons for the major animal-abusing industries or by government officials. And animal rights advocates need to distance themselves clearly and publicly on principled grounds from arsonists and other violent lawbreakers. The case for animal rights uniformly fails to address these important challenges. In other places, I attempt to remedy these omissions. These latter efforts are not meant to replace the case, they are intended to supplement it. Having duly, if painfully, acknowledged my naivete, I cannot help but admire the passionate earnestness of the much younger Tom Regan, the author of this book. Back in the early 1980s, I believed that the animal rights movement was like the captain in the Ami Ayalon quote cited at the beginning of this new preface. Animal rights was a movement that did not know where it wanted to go, a movement therefore destined never to get there, no matter how strong the wind or what its direction. My unrealistic expectations about how the case would change the world have been properly chastened by increasing age and the lessons of time. Even so, I like to hope that this old friend of mine, this book, helps us better understand, by means of rigorous philosophical cartography, shall we say, where the animal rights movement should be heading, and why. Raleigh, North Carolina, December 8, 2003. Preface to the first edition. No book can be all things to all people. This dilemma, common to all those who hope to write for different audiences simultaneously, has been especially acute in the present case. On the one hand, I wanted to write a book that would be accessible to all those who labor for the cause of the better treatment of animals, persons who, for the most part, have professions other than academic philosophy. My hope was to write, in clear, intelligible terms, a book that would lay the philosophical foundations of the animal rights movement as I conceive it. On the other hand, I hoped to write a book that would command the attention of my professional peers in philosophy, one that was more philosophical substance than shadow, inviting the critical application of philosophy's highest standards, including rigor, clarity, justification, analysis, and coherence. The dilemma faced, quite simply, was that a work that perks the attention of philosophers can put others to sleep, while one that keeps the non-philosopher interested runs the risk of philosophy's benign neglect. Add to this a third larger audience I hoped I might reach, comprised of those whose daily work brings them into direct contact with animals, veterinarians and laboratory scientists, for example, and the difficulty of choosing an appropriate style, pace, and tone should be apparent. Understandably, I do not know how well I have struck a proper balance, but perhaps the following remarks, aimed at the several groups of prospective readers, might not be judged inappropriate. To my professional peers in philosophy, I hope you will give this work your understanding indulgence when it spends time explaining ideas you already know well enough, or, as in the summary at the end of each chapter, it reiterates ideas you have already digested, but not when it comes to its arguments and analyses. In these latter places, I assume you will subject what I say, as well as what I fail to say, to the closest critical scrutiny. Since, as I believe, the truth will withstand any fair criticism, what truth, if any, this book contains, can only be decided by how well it stands up under the heat of informed efforts to refute its claims. That is the way the pronouncements of science are tested. I can see no reason why those of philosophy should differ in this respect. To those non-philosophers who work to improve the lot of animals, I ask your patience when the going gets rough. When, for example, there are pages of worry over whether animals have beliefs, or even more over whether a given ethical theory is the best all considered. To explore patiently these and related matters is the only way a reasoned case can be made for animal rights, in my view. Since all who work on behalf of the interests of animals are more than a little familiar with the tired charges of being irrational, sentimental, emotional, or worse, we can give the lie to these accusations only by making a concerted effort not to indulge our emotions or parade our sentiments. And that requires making a sustained commitment to rational inquiry. If some of what follows sometimes takes more than a single reading to make sense, I hope you will spend the necessary time before moving on. I have tried my best to make difficult ideas clear, but even if I have succeeded, that does not make difficult ideas easy. Finally, to all those who come to this book from outside the profession of philosophy and independent of involvement in animal welfare-related activities, your patience is especially to be solicited. All the more so if you are a participant in one of the uses made of animals that is subjected to criticism. For example, the use of animals in science or their treatment in agriculture. As Socrates said, "Not for the first time, but always, I am the sort of person who is persuaded by nothing in me except the proposition which seems to me the best when I reason about it." 2 propositions. First, that animals have certain basic moral rights, and second, that recognition of their rights requires fundamental changes in our treatment of them, seem to me the best when I reason about them. It is not out of malice, then, that the use of animals in science, for example, or hunting and trapping are condemned in the sequel. It is out of respect for what seems to me the best when I reason about it. I hope those of you who lack a philosopher's or animal activist's interest in these issues will persevere and help to test how well I have reasoned about these matters, even if, one might say especially if, the conclusions reached are critical of what you do. The positions defended in this book will be viewed as extremely radical by some and as too moderate by others. That is another respect in which no book can be all things to all people. Certainly, some of the conclusions I reach have surprised even me, and without having tried to do so, the book now appears to contain something to upset just about every special interest group. You will understand me when I say that I hope the conclusions reached will be assessed on their merits by subjecting my arguments to fair, informed criticism rather than by seizing upon isolated claims and denouncing them as too extreme or too radical, or as too moderate or conservative. The pages that follow contain comparatively few facts about how animals are treated. There already exist books not soon to be surpassed that cover these matters. These works are cited in the appropriate places. I have operated on the assumption that those who would take the time to read this book would either already be familiar with these factual works or would use the present work as a stepping stone to them. I have not set out to rival them. What I have sought out to do is articulate and defend, at greater length and in greater depth than others heretofore, what it means to ascribe rights to animals, why we should recognize their rights, and what are some of the principal implications of doing so. Though it should go without saying, it is necessary to add that others who claim to defend the rights of animals may have a quite different understanding of their rights. Indeed, not only might this be so, it clearly is so in some cases. In defending the rights view, as I call it, therefore, I do not presume to speak for all those, whether individuals or organizations, who see themselves as champions of the rights of animals. To make the case for animal rights is the dominant concern of the pages that follow, but not the only one. Short of allowing the miraculous a legitimate role in philosophical argument, no case can be made for the recognition of the rights of animals that fails to make the case for the rights of human beings, and a central objective of the present work is to do just that. At its most general level, therefore, the arguments set forth could, and should, be assessed both in terms of how well the case is made for recognizing the rights of human beings, and in terms of how well the case is made for recognizing the rights of animals. Though I believe the case for the one is neither any weaker nor any stronger than the case for the other, that is a belief others might wish to contest. In any event, because the book attempts to make the case for certain human rights, Those who dismiss animal rightists as anti-human should be silenced. To be for animals is not to be against humanity. To require others to treat animals justly as their rights require is not to ask for anything more nor less in their case than in the case of any human to whom just treatment is due. The animal rights movement is a part of, not opposed to, the human rights movement. Attempts to dismiss it as anti-human are mere rhetoric. The rights view is not a complete theory in its present form. Not all its implications have been addressed, not all its challenges anticipated. Even in the area of justice, many difficult questions, for example about justice in the distribution of harms and benefits between individuals, remain to be explored. The more modest claim made in its behalf is that it identifies, clarifies, and defends a set of ethical principles that must be accommodated by any theory that aspires to be the best theory, all considered. That is not the end-all of one's aspirations in ethical theory, but it is the begin-all of making the case for the rights of animals, and that is enough given present purposes. Hard thinking is humbling. Probably no one who has attempted to clear a path through thickets of difficult ideas has emerged brimming with confidence that every turn was the right one, made for the right reasons. We do our best with the time and talent we have, knowing we cannot avoid every error, but hoping to shed some fresh light on the dark contours of human thought and institutions. Usually we have no cause to say this, or to say more than this, but the matter of animal rights is not usual in some respects. Not only are animals incapable of defending their rights, they are similarly incapable of defending themselves against those who profess to defend them. Unlike us, they cannot disown or repudiate the claims made on their behalf. That makes speaking for them a greater, not a lesser, moral undertaking. And this makes the burdens of one's errors and fallacies when championing their rights heavier, not lighter. With those who find mistakes in these pages that have eluded my grasp, therefore, may I take the unusual step to ask that you earnestly consider whether these mistakes can be avoided or corrected without weakening the kind of protection for animals sought by the rights view. The impotence of those about whose moral status we debate, when the merits of our arguments are at issue, imposes special constraints on those of us who debate them. By all means, then, let the bad arguments be identified and thrown out, but may those who find them look beyond them. Many people have helped me write this book, including many of my past teachers and students. I thank them all. Ruth Boone and Anne Reeves deserve special thanks for helping prepare the manuscript for publication, Carol Leba for helping make the final draft more readable, and Sheila Berg, editor at the University of California Press, for her unfailing support and encouragement. Even greater is my debt to Dale Jameson, who over the years challenged my thought at every turn and helped save me from making some really foolish mistakes. His influence is present throughout. Most of the book was written during the academic year 1980 to 1981, during my tenure as a recipient of a Category B fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. My gratitude to the endowment is very great indeed. I.T. Littleton, director, and the staff of D.H. Hill Library at my university also have my thanks for making the facilities of the library available to me for purposes of my research. My children, Brian and Karen, understood and accepted my preoccupation while writing the book with the wisdom of their youth, and my wife, Nancy, discussed every aspect of the project with me, well beyond the point I had the right to expect that anyone would or should. That the book will see the light of day is in no small measure due to her patience and support. She also deserves the lion's share of credit for selecting Stefan Lochner's St. Jerome in his study to serve on the book's frontispiece. Tom Regan, Raleigh, North Carolina, November 26, 1981.